Hello everyone and welcome back to ESL 65 Pronunciation and Conversation. We are well on our way, everyone. We're almost halfway through, if you can believe it, with our course. And we're on chapter 6, which talks about ED endings in English. Very similar to what we looked at in the previous chapter, which talked about the S ending. We talked about different grammatical forms that use the S ending. We talked about the third person singular S ending for he, she, and it. We talked about using S for plural nouns, right? To make a noun plural. In English, we usually use S. We talked about the possessive apostrophe S that we use in English for possession. And then we also talked about how we use the final S ending for contractions. The apostrophe S in contractions. He's, she's, its would be another example of a contraction ending in apostrophe S. So very similar to what we looked at in chapter 5. Based on the final consonant sound or the final vowel sound, and whether that final sound is voiced, vibration, or voiceless, no vibration, that will dictate how the ED is pronounced. So really similar. I think you're going to find that chapter 6 is going to be very doable, very understandable for you, because the grammatical forms and the ideas that we looked at in chapter 5 on Tuesday are going to be very similar to today. So our objectives for chapter 6 are to understand the importance of pronouncing the ED endings clearly with the correct pronunciation. And there are some different ways to do that. We'll talk about that this chapter. The grammatical forms we talked about last class for the final S. What grammatical forms use the ED ending? Can you think of a few? Perhaps the past tense, simple past tense, many verbs in English end in ED. Walked, talked, there's so many. Walked, talked, watched, looked. It's hard to think of them off on the fly, but you know what I mean. Simple past tense. And there are other grammatical forms that we'll talk about as well. But that's the most popular one. And we'll look at different pronunciations and the spelling and how that affects the different pronunciations of ED endings. So in summary, grammatical ED endings have 3 possible pronunciations. We'll look at that in this chapter. And we have a little warm-up to do to start off, and that is on page 40, exercise 1. Sorry, little boy in the background. If you take a look at exercise 1 on page 40, you'll see that there is a conversation. Julio is on a phone conversation with his friend about his first day at college. Listen to CD1, track 44. Right? You can go to CD1, track 44, and then see if you can identify the verbs that are being used here. Most all of them are going to be in the past tense, right? With ED ending. See if you can identify those, and then practice the pronunciation. Do you hear any differences in how the ED is pronounced? This is a great warm-up activity. This is exercise 1 on page 40. And this is where we're going to start our activities for today in chapter 6, ED endings in English. Welcome.